This is the most densely populated country in the world. Its population is approaching 2 billion people. Almost 75% of them are poor, with an average monthly salary of $100, and over 800 million people live on just $1 a day. Nearly 3,000 people die from hunger here each year. This country has about 14 million slaves, the highest number in the world. More than 500 million people have never used plumbing or sewage systems. Over 40% of women and 25% of men are illiterate. Corruption is rampant, and food meant for the poor is simply stolen. This is about India. But despite all these problems, this country already ranks third in the world in GDP. And according to expert forecasts, in 50 years it will reach first place in production volume, surpassing not only the USA but also China. How is this possible? And is it even possible at all? And why has Western capital recently been massively shifting from China to India? Why might India turn China into a deserted ghost country in this decade? Let's figure it out. It is obvious to everyone that China and India are completely different countries, yet they share quite a few similarities. India gave the world chess, mathematics, and the Kama Sutra, while China introduced gunpowder, printing, the compass, and much more. The modern history of both nations began almost simultaneously. India gained independence from British rule in 1947, and in 1949, the Communist Party, led by Mao Zedong, came to power in China. It was during this time that the People's Republic of China was proclaimed, and the old elites fled to Taiwan. At the same time of independence, both countries faced severe economic problems. In the 1940s, India was considered the world's poorest country, unable to even feed its population. China's situation was slightly better, but still bleak, with a predominantly rural population and almost no industry. Both countries were close allies with the Soviet Union and developed along the socialist paths. However, it soon became clear that socialism took different forms in these countries. China quickly became an authoritarian state, with the Communist Party maintaining a very strong and strict control. India, on the other hand, followed a much more liberal path. Although the Indian government attempted to control nearly all aspects of society and the economy, it wasn't always successful. Therefore, comparing the Chinese and Indian systems isn't so much a tale of two civilizations, but rather a story of two distinct economic models. Is authoritarianism and iron-fisted rule good for the economy? Experts are divided on this question. In the short term, authoritarianism can positively impact the economy, but in the long run, it almost always falls short compared to the liberal approach. We can see this playing out in the cases of China and India. China's first attempt at industrialization began in the 1950s, a period now known as the Great Leap Forward. This marked the initial efforts to industrialize the Chinese countryside. People built small smelting furnaces in almost every yard to provide not only food but also steel and iron for themselves and nearby towns. This policy ended a massive failure and famine, resulting in the deaths of at least 15 million Chinese in the early 1960s. The second wave of industrialization came in the early 1970s, when China had a falling out with the USSR and began establishing economic ties with the USA. It was then that American capital and technology began flowing into the country. Americans were drawn by both the low cost of labor and the fact that the Chinese handled all the challenging work of recruiting employees. Consequently, by the late 1970s, Deng Xiaoping had implemented a socialist market economy, leading to the rapid growth in the Chinese economy and a sharp rise in living standards. The handover of Hong Kong to the PRC in 1997 also played a crucial role.
We shall not forget you, and we shall watch with the closest interest as you embark on this new era of your remarkable history.
The Hong Kong Stock Exchange effectively became the gateway for foreign capital into the Chinese economy, and China's accession to the WTO made the country one of the most attractive destinations for foreign investment. As a result, in the early 2000s, the so-called Chinese economic miracle began. New technologies poured into the country, the level of education among the population rose dramatically, and highly skilled specialists emerged who could work not only in textile factories but also in computer manufacturing. Banking technologies began to develop rapidly, even though China remained an authoritarian country. Freedom of speech was strictly suppressed, and the Communist Party held exclusive power. But for capitalists, as you can understand, these aspects are less important if investments bring money. India's situation was far worse. Economic reforms only began in the 1990s. Before that, large businesses were mostly under state control. Formerly, capitalists could open their own enterprises in India, but it required countless approvals and licenses. The state's control over business was very poor. Case in point, the Bhopal disaster of 1984, when an accident at a chemical plant owned by an Indo-American company affected between 150,000 and 600,000 people, depending on estimates. Paradoxically, this disaster unintentionally became an advertisement for investing in India. Why? It's very simple. The world learned that in India, it was unnecessary to spend huge sums on safety systems at hazardous facilities, and that human life there was valued cheaply. The company that owned the plant paid $470 million in compensation to all the victims. Admit it, if such a tragedy had occurred in Europe or America, the compensation would have been tens of times larger. Subsequently, India became attractive to investors primarily as a location for chemical and other hazardous industries. In the early 1990s, Prime Minister Narasimha Rao began implementing liberal economic reforms. Business licensing was significantly simplified, resulting in an increase in Western capital entering the country. Initially, India was far less attractive than China. China was already an industrially developed region with well-established production chains. However, at the peak of the Chinese economic miracle in the early 2000s, large Western corporations began gradually shifting their production from China to India. Apple and Samsung were among the first, with others following their lead. Why did this happen? The reason lies within China itself. The world viewed the country as a factory without much of a voice. However, this position did not satisfy China. China has always considered itself a great power with an ancient history. After the collapse of the USSR, China rightly decided to take its place. This is precisely the root of China's problem. The world didn't need another great power demanding to be taken seriously. It's one thing to be a country factory, it's another to try to shape world politics. China's neighbors, economically and industrially advanced Korea and Japan, were not comfortable with even regional dominance by China. And globally, China faced even more significant competitors, the USA and Europe. Thus, the first reason is China's political ambitions. There's also a second reason: technology theft. China lacked its own technologies. Almost everything was imported from abroad. For example, car enthusiasts were amazed at how China managed to establish its own automobile manufacturing in such a short time, just a couple of decades. While Chinese cars were a rarity 20 years ago, they're now everywhere. Where did these automotive engineers come from? Nowhere. It was technology theft. Volkswagen, for instance, one of the first Western auto giants to build its own plant in China, hoped to sell cars in the domestic market and make a profit. Instead, after a short time, it faced a flood of Chinese clones of its cars, selling at much lower prices. Moreover, these Chinese cars, built using stolen technologies, gradually began appearing in other markets, competing with Volkswagen itself. Would Volkswagen be interested in continuing cooperation with such partners? Of course not. It's no surprise that many companies, primarily Apple and Samsung, started moving their most high-tech manufacturing to other countries: Taiwan, Vietnam, and India. Just 15 years ago, almost 100% of Apple's devices were assembled in China. Now, 25% are made in India, and this figure is growing. Another reason is the low number of Chinese brands. For a long time, the term Chinese product has been synonymous with cheap and low quality. Sure, everything made under the umbrella of major Western corporations undergoes strict quality control, but the fact remains that consumers are increasingly reluctant to buy products made in China, regardless of the label they're sold under. Lastly, the fourth reason is the rise in Chinese living standards and, consequently, the increase in wages. It's clear that high-tech manufacturing requires far more skilled specialists. And while someone sewing cheap clothes might be willing to work for a few dollars a day, a person assembling computers is not. Around the end of the 2000s, China's economic growth slowed. Exports began to gradually decline, yet huge sums of money had been invested in manufacturing, and it was necessary to increase turnover. How? By developing the domestic market. However, this is a double-edged sword. On one hand, manufacturing began to grow, as China's domestic market is one of the largest in the world. On the other hand, a severe debt market emerged among both the population and businesses. For a worker to buy more goods, they must either receive a high salary or have access to cheap loans. In China, both occurred. A large middle class was formed, and the middle class needed their own housing. The result was a rapid construction boom, and all of this was financed by credit. Over the past decades, a mortgage credit bubble grew, accompanied by the country's rising political ambitions. China wanted to be on equal footing with the USA. Did the Americans like this? No. As a result, in 2018, U.S. President Donald Trump imposed tariffs on Chinese products entering the country. China became less attractive as a global factory. The outcome? An acceleration of manufacturing relocation to other countries. It's unwise to put all your eggs in one basket. Initially, production was moved to Vietnam and Thailand. More recently, to India. India is more convenient. Firstly, it has much more territory. Hundreds of thousands of factories can be built. Secondly, there's a large pool of poor people willing to work for meager wages. Moreover, they're somewhat content with their poverty. It's worth noting that India's population is mainly Hindu and Buddhist. According to their beliefs, death is just a stage of existence. In this life, you may belong to the lowest castle of untouchables, but if you behave well, you'll be born into a different castle in your next life. So the drive to get rich isn't as pronounced here as it is in China.
Money is just a process, but a whole lot of people are beginning to think that money is a goal by itself. Money is not a goal, I want you to remember.
It's also worth remembering that India is a former British colony and has historically been close to the English-speaking world. Indian elites traditionally get their education at top British universities. Another key point: besides 1 billion poor people, India has a substantial number of educated middle and upper-class individuals. Learning math from age 3 is the norm here, so finding enough qualified personnel for businesses isn't hard. Also, India has never claimed to be a world superpower, either politically or economically. The rupee isn't a freely convertible global currency. Two more advantages. First, India has no industrial competitors in its region. It's the most industrially developed country there. You can't even compare it to Pakistan and Bangladesh. And Arabian Peninsula countries make their money differently, not through manufacturing. Plus, it's easier to ship goods to Europe from India. It's closer than China, which is another important factor. Also, China's one-child policy, which was in place for many years, has caused the population to age rapidly. This means their working-age population will shrink over time. India doesn't have this problem. Its birth rate is much higher. One more Indian specialty: they have loads of programmers, and cheap ones at that. Several major tech hubs have already been built there, with more on the way. Basically, Indians are starting to dump prices in the world's fastest-growing market, computer technology. So they're becoming doubly profitable. Many tech giants have their customer support based in India, which is big money. So India is becoming a much more attractive country for investment. Plus, having overpopulated poor Pakistan and Bangladesh next door gives Western partners an extra advantage. If, God forbid, India starts showing political ambitions, it's easy to stir up a serious military crisis on its borders. And Western partners know this, as does the Indian government. So India is a much more manageable partner than China. Also, India has a more liberal economic policy than China. Power shifts don't affect everything. China, on the other hand, had to be brought into line with much harsher methods. I'm not one for conspiracy theories, but facts are stubborn things. In 2018, Trump announced higher tariffs on Chinese goods. That same year, human rights activists worldwide suddenly started accusing China of oppressing the Uyghurs. They had been oppressed for decades, but only now did activists bring it to the world's attention. After that, the U.S. increased its naval presence near China, and in December 2020, China was hit hard by the coronavirus epidemic, severely affecting its industry. But again, we're not talking conspiracy theories here, we're talking about the West and India getting closer. There's an interesting detail. The official U.S. delegation boycotted the 2022 Winter Olympics in China. Athletes came without officials. India joined the diplomatic boycott too, sending just one athlete and no officials. You've got to admit it is odd. India has 14 million slaves, but they're very worried about the Uyghurs in China. This move is purely political. India showed its loyalty to Western policy and proved it's a reliable partner who will play by the rules. Making predictions is a tricky business. Economists are claiming that in 50 years, India will be the world's top country by GDP. If everything goes according to plan, it could happen. But when does anything ever go according to plan? There are global crises, sharp drops in goods consumption, and military conflicts on India's border. Plus, the competitors aren't sitting idle. China has no plans to give up its top spot. Could an armed conflict break out? It's possible, so I'm not making any predictions, just observing. It's going to be interesting. If you like this video, hit that subscribe button and give it a thumbs up. See you soon!